The castle was burning, and from this columns of dark smoke rose into the air. The gargoyle with pointed ears and sharp fangs protruding strongly from its mouth narrowed its eyes a little and looked at the burning castle, guessing that in this case it meant that the demon lord named Lon was dead. As he continued to ponder this, the gargoyle also realized that this meant that he would now be free. Overjoyed, the gargoyle, coming out of the bushes, stopped at the edge of the cliff and, stretching both arms up, looked at the sun, shouting joyfully. A little later, the gargoyle returned to the forest and, finding a path leading between the trees, went forward. Having accidentally stepped on a small puddle of mud, he stopped and, looking at his dirty foot, turned to the gods, saying that this was painfully good. Stretching his arms up again, the gargoyle declared that freedom is wonderful. As he continued on his way, he made a mental note that his name was Albert. Albert knew he was a gargoyle, although he thought he had a name like a human prince. This caused Albert to become a little more irritated and, closing his eyes, he mentally noted that all claims should be brought against his creator. However, this creator left this world long ago, as he was killed by the demon Lord Lon. Albert remembered how a man with horns and furry ears growing on his head, grinning, pierced the man standing in front of him with a sword, hiding his face under the hood of a cloak. Blood immediately poured from the wound, and Albert, distracted from these memories, imagined himself sitting among the boxes and bags, remembering that in the first year of his life, he was unable to resist what was happening due to the magic of control, which made him an obedient slave. Then, sitting among the supplies, he thought that it looked like another one trophy. Due to the magic of control, Albert was deprived of freedom of choice, and became like a weak-willed puppet following the orders of his master. Albert saw himself as a small doll, to which threads were attached, going upward, to two crossed sticks, which Lon held in his hands, controlled by Albert. Anyone who was defeated by the control spell was treated like garbage, with a very short shelf life. Albert knew this because he had seen monsters lying limp on the battlefield and dying from the terrible wounds they received. But now, holding his chin in his hand, Albert noted with satisfaction that fate itself was on his side, since he had not really lived before the death of the demon Lord Lon. For 1,500 years, Albert did nothing but fight, and each wound was forever imprinted in his memory. Under the influence of a spell of submission, he, with his head limply lowered, flew over the battlefield, holding a weapon in his hands. Now Albert remembered that he dreamed of the day when he could take revenge, but Lons died before this happened. However, Albert did not dwell too much on this and simply decided that he would live the rest of his life as it pleased his soul. This thought gave Albert pleasure, and he, unable to restrain himself, began to tremble, shouting that he was free. He imagined eating until his stomach swelled, relaxing on a sun lounger on the seashore and holding a glass of cocktail in his hands, and walking with a gargoyle girl. Continuing to stand with his arms outstretched, Albert noted that he was left without money, power, and status in society. But, closing his eyes, did not despair because of this and decided that he did not need these little things. This is how the life of the gargoyle began in long-awaited freedom. And suddenly Albert lowered his hands, noticing something that caught his attention. This object turned out to be a castle, visible above the treetops, from which clouds of black smoke rose into the air. Albert was surprised and asked if Lon's castle was still burning down. Putting his palms together, he closed his eyes and thanked someone unknown for all the difficult years of the war. Immediately after this, Albert continued on his way, noting that it was all gorgeous. He didn't know what he could do about it, so he asked himself about it. In the end, Albert decided that first he needed to get out of the forest and continued to walk lightly and cheerfully along the forest path, never ceasing to smile happily. But suddenly someone's voice was heard a little to the side, and Albert, hearing this, forced himself to stop and look warily ahead. Looking out from behind the bushes, he saw several gargoyles passing among themselves. One of the gargoyles, crossing her arms over her chest, told her interlocutor that she also thought that this was some kind of cruelty. Albert, watching the gargoyles from behind the foliage, asked himself, who are they? He suggested that they might be weakened gargoyles, deciding that in this case it would most likely be necessary to talk to them, since they might know where to go. However, despite a well-thought-out plan of action, Albert still did not come out from behind the bushes, but, on the contrary, after just sitting in place for some time, he turned his back to the gargoyles, squatting down in such a way as to completely hide behind the foliage. Albert grabbed his head with his hands, mentally telling himself not to worry. Albert tried to convince himself that these were his comrades, and therefore ordered himself to simply approach them. However, even these persuasions to himself did not work, and Albert continued to sit, hiding behind the bushes. He didn't understand why he couldn't do it, but he finally decided he needed to be careful. This forced Albert to analyze the current situation, and he realized that he had no other way. The gargoyle standing behind the bushes, in Albert's opinion, looked friendly, and so he, finally making up his mind, told himself to go forward for victory. Peeking out from behind the bushes, he tried to casually wave his hand in a welcoming gesture, called out to the gargoyles and asked why they were so sad. He assumed that they needed help, but when Albert noticed that the gargoyles were standing and silently looking at him, he froze, still holding his hand outstretched forward. His confidence disappeared, and, sweating with excitement and closing his eyes, Albert noted that he was ashamed. He had not spoken to anyone in 1500 years and asked himself what he expected without a single practice. And, although Albert understood that he had never communicated with anyone, he was still upset that everything turned out this way. The gargoyles standing in the clearing were still silent, looking at Albert, and he looked at them in response, distracted from his thoughts. Focusing on one of the gargoyles, who stood with his arms crossed over his chest and watching Albert without looking away, Albert asked himself why this gargoyle reacted to his words like that. He suggested that in this way the interlocutor shows surprise, and noted that this is very awkward. Finally, the gargoyle Albert was focusing on began to speak, explaining that they were talking about the best way to reach the city of Farah. Albert thought, putting his hand on his chin, and repeating the name of the city out loud. He remembered that this was the closest city to the south of here. The gargoyle, meanwhile, explained that they planned to travel by air and wondered if they could fly to the Farah mountain range without unnecessary hassle. Albert asked, "Aren't there wyverns there?" The other gargoyles agreed with this, and Albert, punching one hand into the open palm of the other, noted that if you look at it from another perspective, the risk of getting into trouble is noticeably reduced if you work as a team. If something happened, they would either run away together or fight back the wyverns, and so Albert exclaimed that they should all become friends for centuries. The other gargoyle turned sideways to Albert, put her hands on her hips and, although hesitant, still agreed with Albert's proposed idea. Albert was happy to hear this and realized that the gargoyles liked his plan. At this moment, the gargoyle, who, apparently, was the leader among the company, turned her back to Albert, began to walk forward, announcing that it was time to hit the road. Albert agreed, exclaiming that he was talking about this too, and, turning to the rest of the gargoyles, asked if they were all ready. The gargoyles gradually began to rise into the air, and Albert thought that he had been waiting for this day for a very long time. Being with friends, working with them on the same team was Albert's personal fairy tale. Thinking about this, he closed his eyes and smiled dreamily, but was distracted by someone calling out to him. Albert opened his eyes, looking at the gargoyle, whose leg he grabbed so that another gargoyle would carry him, and asked, "What is it?" The gargoyle exclaimed indignantly that there was nothing like that and ordered Albert to let it go. Removing his hands, Albert asked the gargoyle not to be angry, and the gargoyle took the opportunity to fly higher, ordering its comrades to move forward. Albert screamed, extending his hand towards the gargoyles, but they, only turning slightly towards him, said goodbye to Albert. Albert asked what the gargoyles were saying. He asked them to stop and asked in what sense they were saying goodbye to him. Albert asked if they weren't friends. He announced that his heart could not stand this, and the gargoyles, hearing this, displeasedly asked, "What is Albert saying about friends?" They did not understand why he bothered them at all, and exclaimed that they did not need something useless. Albert, narrowing his eyes, repeated the word useless in his thoughts and, starting to wave his arms, closed his eyes, asking what they were talking about. Albert didn't understand how he managed to mess up, and suggested that they forget it and make every effort to achieve a joint result. In desperation, he asked his relatives to stop mocking him, but the gargoyles simply remained silent, looking at him contemptuously. Albert asked why they were silent. He asked the gargoyles to say something, and the gargoyles finally announced that they did not need Albert. Albert remained standing, looking after his retreating gargoyles, who, having flown some distance away, again said goodbye to him. Albert asked, "What is this?" Out of despair, he fell to his knees, leaning his hands on the ground, and, lowering his head, asked why everything was like this. He was also disappointed that he could not fly, and almost cried, mentally saying that the plan had failed. Tears still appeared in the corners of his eyes, and, moving a little to the side, towards the bushes, Albert sat down next to him, clasping his knees with his hands, and desperately thought that nothing had worked out. In the end, everything turned out in such a way that Albert simply sat, watching as his relatives left him, getting rid of him as if they were something useless. Because of this, Albert mentally asked, "Are they really doing this seriously?" At the end of the war between the demon lords of Lon and Berea, which Albert had fought in since day one, his wings burned out. Now, thinking about it, Albert remembered how he stood in the middle of the ruins, spreading his wings, engulfed in fire. He imagined himself hugging his lost wings and admitted that he was very grateful for everything, glad that a time of peace had arrived. Thoughtfully holding his chin in his hand, Albert suggested that he needed to say something similar to the wings in parting, and then, changing the topic of his reasoning, he noted although he sacrificed his wings among the 20 young demons, Berea turned out to be the best. In Albert's thoughts, an image of a demon girl with wings growing from her lower back and pointed ears appeared. Sadly looking straight ahead, Albert thought that now it would be good to use self-regeneration, at least some kind. Angry, he swore, thinking about Berea, but shook his head, forced himself to distract himself from these thoughts and decided that he needed to think positively. Yes, Albert fought in the War of the Demon Lords and it was extremely pointless, but in the end, Albert's fate, in his opinion, turned out quite well, and if you think about it like that, then nothing too terrible happened, although Albert understood that from the wounds received cannot be eliminated. In general, he thought that he was luckier than the others because the other gargoyles were young people who had appeared quite recently. Thinking about his advantages over the younger gargoyles, Albert thought that he, for example, managed to fight an ancient dragon, which has the strongest roar among all its brothers. Albert remembered how, with the help of the wings that were still with him, he rose into the air, stopping in front of a monster with huge fangs and long claws on its paws. As for the other gargoyles, they were in the eastern part and remained without a single scar, as they were kept with them as powerful pets. Albert imagined several gargoyles standing against the silhouette of Berea, and, closing his eyes, noted that the main thing was that Albert himself was able to survive after the battle with that monster, and thought that if he did not praise himself, then no one would praise him. And again imagining the gargoyles flying away, he sadly thought that all his comrades were still very young chicks, admitting to himself that he even felt a little sorry for them, although they did something insignificant to him. Once again forcing himself to distract himself from such thoughts, Albert shook his head from side to side and, ordering himself to stop, noted that the past is good, but what is more important is what will happen in the future. From that moment on, Albert decided to think only about the future, and in order to make his decision more impressive in his own eyes, he clenched his palms into fists, looking confidently forward. And suddenly, remembering the most important tasks ahead, Albert licked his palm to his stomach and noted that he needed to eat. He understood that it would not be funny at all to die of starvation when he had just gained freedom. When Albert was under the spell, energy flowed into him, but now there were problems with this, and, scratching his chin with a finger, Albert decided that now this problem was a priority. He remembered how he received nutrition as a slave, and imagined a silhouette of himself and the demon Lord Lon, connected by the relationship of a slave and one who provides energy from food. Sitting on the ground, Albert decided that he needed to think about where to find food, and realized that the first option was to hunt monsters in the vicinity of the forest and eat the prey. However, in this case, one could not forget that a poisonous enemy might come across, although if prepared correctly, it should have turned out quite well. Albert imagined how he would fight a huge monster, after which he remembered how he sat with his creator and ate meat roasted over a fire. He still remembered the wonderful old days when he ate with his creator. In addition, Albert helped the creator in his work, and he taught Albert language, life and magic. Those were good times, and now, thoughtfully holding his chin in his hand, Albert realized that the creator had taught him everything he could. However, the creator did not teach Albert how to cook, and so now Albert had to succumb to chance. Even if the target turned out to be poisonous, he still needed something to fill his stomach, and, having thought through the first option, Albert realized that there was also a second one, which was to get to the nearest city and have a good meal at a local cafe. Thinking of himself sitting at the table with our napkin tied, Albert noted that in this case he would not have to cook, and, at the same time, he would eat properly. The only problem was that Albert had no money, which meant that he would have to work somewhere before lunch. Among the options he considered was working in construction. Thinking back to the moment when the other gargoyles flew away, Albert assumed that flying over the mountain range was probably a lot of fun, and again thought that he had been treated as something insignificant and useless. Lost in thought, Albert calculated that he had to go for about 5 days, and admitted to himself that he did not know whether he could withstand this hungry hell. In that case, the last option left was to borrow supplies from Demon Lord Berea's army. Imagining himself stealing a box of food and running away, Albert noted that this was a good plan, but mentally wondered if he could do it. He did not even see Berea's face as he approached her through the fire, and, moreover, he did not know how to find the army camp. In addition, fighting in Albert's position was extremely disadvantageous, because Berea only had to wish, and Armea would do everything for her. Berea was one of the silent rulers who never kill with their own hands, but do it easily with the hands of others. In addition, Albert remembered everything that happened between him and Berea, and went back some time when, grabbing Berea by the hair, he spun her in the air and threw her to the ground, after which he took a weapon and pierced Berea with it. While Berea lay on the ground, looking at Albert, he slowly approached her, unable to hold back the saliva that flowed from his mouth in anticipation of victory. Bending over Berea, Albert growled, and the saliva that had accumulated in his mouth fell onto the face of Berea, who clenched her teeth. Now Albert thought a little sadly that it turned out very badly, but also noted that he couldn't even choose where and who to look at, and he understood that the spell was to blame for everything, but still felt awkward because of it. And suddenly he noticed a thin hair clinging to his hand, and realized that it belonged to Berea. He suggested that he could use magic to create the things he needed, and this thought made Albert sweat with tension and ask himself, was he really some kind of pervert? Berea was an ancient, powerful bloodsucker, and Albert asked what if there was terrifying magic in her hair? Focusing on Berea, Albert, becoming noticeably sadder, asked if she could ever forgive him, but he did not intend to kill Berea, and, remembering how he wounded her in the stomach, he assumed that her stomach was capable of regeneration and the wound would not remain. Albert asked himself, could he do this to a beautiful girl? He supposed it would be a good idea to just say hello first, and as he thought about it, Albert wondered if there would be something scary about Berea being some sort of old enemy of his. As he imagined himself gently placing his hand on Berea's cheek, Albert also imagined himself telling her that she would instantly become the most charming woman on earth. However, Albert immediately stopped thinking about it, deciding that this would not end well, and noted that he thought a lot about everything that happened. Finally, after imagining himself bowing before Berea, Albert decided that he had better not continue, noting that he did not think that he would be recognized and forgiven for his mistakes. Tears appeared in Albert's eyes again, and he, looking at the sky, called himself pathetic. Some time passed, and Albert simply decided to follow the signs, because in this way he had to go to the city of Farah, and along the way he could hunt the local fauna. Albert imagined how he would catch the monster, and then go to the family, where upon arrival he would find a job and eat very well, and at the same time save money. Every thought Albert had was accompanied by an image of him fetching logs or sitting at the table with a plate filled with food. In the city, Albert would have been able to talk to someone, since now he understood that it was not very good for him to be alone, noting that he also would not like to live in mountainous places. Albert assumed that he would reach the city of Farah in 5 days, and even if he did not find food, he would definitely have to survive on the water for 5 days. Fortunately, Albert was subject to water magic, and thus he was able to replenish his fluid balance. Activating his magic, Albert made water appear in the air in front of him, exclaiming that it was very convenient. If you strengthen your own body with the help of magic, then it was possible that you could reach your final goal in just 1 day, but Albert said that there was no need to attract too much attention. In the end, he decided that he would go to the city on foot and, heading in the right direction, began to hum softly, exclaiming that he was going on an adventure. Some time passed on the way and, looking around, Albert noticed that it was very calm around and there were no magical creatures. Taking his chin with his hand, he noted that if he thought about it, he would only need to find just one creature in order to eat. Calling out to the evil spirits, Albert asked for it to come out, and, turning around so that it could be heard from all sides, he continued to call out to the evil spirits until he heard someone scream. This made Albert freeze, and noting that it was loud, Albert realized that it was a girl who had screamed. He was delighted to realize that evil spirits had appeared, and mentally exclaimed that he would finally eat. Walking forward, Albert continued to call for evil spirits, but suddenly realized that nothing was working. Dramatically extending his hand forward and barely holding back the tears that appeared in his eyes, he asked if he was really asking that much. In addition, Albert again began to feel sad that he did not have wings, and noted that it would be great to go back and fly. Because of this, he became even sadder and did not understand that he himself said about it and was upset himself. Looking around, Albert looked at the bushes and trees, noting that he was already tired of this view. However, despite this, He continued on his way until he noticed something. Albert suddenly stopped, looked thoughtfully at his legs, and excitedly asked why it was so short. In addition, Albert's stride width was very tiny, and because of this, the mountain range was so far away that it was not even visible. Continuing his journey, Albert admitted to himself that he did not know how many hours he had been walking here, but suddenly he cried out in pain as he stepped on a branch lying on the ground, which, having cracked, pierced his leg. He fell to the ground in surprise and, closing his eyes, grabbed his wounded leg with his hands, shouting that he was in great pain. Tears appeared in the corners of his eyes, and, pulling out the twig that had stuck into his leg and throwing that side, Albert shouted in frustration that he had stepped on it again, asking why there were so many branches and pebbles here. This irritated him very much, and Albert noted that if he had flown, such problems would not have arisen. He lay down on the ground, dreamily thinking that he needed shoes, and decided that he would come to the city, earn money and immediately buy it for himself. It definitely had to be waterproof shoes, and, getting up to continue the journey, Albert decided that first he would need to eat. He was going to eat to his fill and then do other things, and thinking about this, he walked, trying to step more carefully on his wounded leg, from which blood was dripping. The evening of the second day came, and Albert finally stopped, exclaiming with delight that he could see a mountain range. In the distance, behind the treetops, the mountains were really visible, and Albert asked himself, was he finally at his goal? To be honest, he didn't know how he would get over the mountains, but he was distracted from these thoughts by feeling his stomach growl. Wrapping his arms around his stomach, Albert bent over a little, thinking that he was really hungry. Looking down at his feet, he asked if he could chew the earth, but Albert abandoned this idea and thought it was nonsense, realizing that there was no other way out. Decisively clenching his fist, he frowned and mentally exclaimed that he was a gargoyle and a born hunter. He imagined himself as he was before losing his wings, and noted that this was why he was in such a predicament. Shaking his head, Albert ordered himself to stop and thought that his stomach was empty, and there was not a single adequate thought in his head. He understood that he could use various magic, but he just had no idea how to feed himself. Imagining the water, fire, light and air that were under his control, Albert admitted that this was not surprising. The evil spirits never showed up, and Albert asked himself why it was hiding. He assumed that this was because Lon had died, and therefore everything in the forest had also changed a lot. Intertwining his fingers with each other, Albert, closing his eyes, concentrated and began to call out to the evil spirits, suggesting that if he prayed properly, he would certainly meet it. He asked the evil spirits to appear as quickly as possible, and suddenly he heard something. This made Albert scared at first, but after that he was happy, exclaiming that everything worked out. Running in the direction where the scream was coming from, Albert exclaimed that he heard the girl's voice and asked if the heroine had really appeared. He ran to the right place, noticing a girl with a terrible dragon hanging in the air. The girl was very scared, and Albert asked who she was. He assumed that his eyes were already failing him, and having looked more closely at the girl, who was clutching the slime to herself, looking up in fear, he realized that it was obviously a goblin, as well as a little girl with a strange voice. He asked who else it could be. Squinting his eyes a little, Albert came to terms with what had happened, realizing that he wanted evil spirits, and this appeared. Clenching his hand into a fist, Albert noted that he was not a hero, but asked if he should save this girl. The dragon that attacked the girl growled, causing the girl to scream even louder, desperately looking at the monster approaching her. However, before anything happened, Albert used a water barrier, blocking the monster's path to the girl. The girl, already prepared for something terrible, closed her eyes, but, realizing that nothing was happening, she opened her eyes, and Albert, standing in front of her, announced that the girl was safe. He noted that she did not want to die and explained that this was why her voice appeared in his eardrums. Placing his hand on the girl's head, Albert looked at her, noticing that she was not injured. The girl, looking at Albert in surprise, asked who he was. Albert was surprised to hear this question and wanted to answer something, but did not have time, as the dragon began to approach the barrier, growling menacingly and showing sharp fangs growing in its mouth. Looking at the dragon, Albert drew the girl's attention to how angry it was. The girl was scared and tried to make herself appear smaller, and Albert noted that in another situation he had simply run away, but now he was hungry. Coming out of the water barrier, he suggested starting, and looked carefully at the dragon soaring in the air. Almost immediately he asked himself, who was pulling his tongue? Frowning a little with displeasure, Albert asked himself if he was happy now. He realized that whoever was now under the dragon was too self-confident, and asked if it was funny that his enemy was the one on top, and Albert was the gargoyle stuck below. The dragon laughed and covered its mouth with its wing, as if to show that it was asking what Albert hoped for. Albert, noticing this, announced that the monster had angered him and, frowning, said that he was ready. Looking at the dragon, he asked himself where to start in order not to damage the meat. The dragon growled and Albert asked why it was so fast. He didn't understand why he didn't think of it, but he promised that as soon as the dragon got closer, it would be over. When the dragon began to descend to attack Albert, Albert waited for the right moment and waved his hand, tearing the dragon's throat with his sharp claws. The girl screamed, not expecting this, and the dragon fell to the ground, and Albert, who had previously crouched down to make it easier to strike, stood up and apologized to the dragon, saying that he would guarantee that the death of this one was not in vain. Looking at the monster, he noted that it was easy since he just caught the right pace and that was all. Now it was time for lunch, and looking at the dragon, Albert crossed his arms, asking how to eat this. To be honest, he didn't know how to cook, and so he asked whether he should boil the dragon or fry it. Thinking about it, Albert noted that he was not particularly good with fire magic, but still imagined sticks on which meat was strung, roasting over a fire, as well as a small pot of soup standing on the fire. This only made Albert's stomach grow more memorized, and placing his palm on it, Albert suggested that we should start from the very beginning. He thought about how he could clean the dragon, and, feeling the monster, he noticed that the softest place was its stomach. It didn't look particularly tasty, but there was no way out, and, opening his mouth, Albert wished himself bon appetit. But before Albert could take even one bite, the girl, still protected by the water barrier, asked Albert to wait and not eat it. Albert was surprised to hear the girl's voice, and, getting up, turned in her direction, realizing that he had completely forgotten about her. After removing the water barrier, he asked why he shouldn't eat it. He recalled that people eat meat, and added that his body desperately requires meat. Crossing his arms over his chest, Albert asked what was wrong. The girl, desperately screaming, asked Albert to spare her and not eat her, and then, pointing her hand at the monster, announced that the fact was that the meat of the wyvern, which this monster turned out to be, was poisonous. Albert asked again, and the girl explained that wyverns have poison that serves as a defense mechanism, and until a person has dried the meat for about a week, it cannot be eaten. Albert was upset when he heard this and asked if it was true. He also asked if he really had to wait a whole week. The girl asked if Albert really didn't know this. She was surprised by this and asked what Albert was going to do. Albert became even sadder and, leaning forward slightly, said that he understood everything and thanked the girl for warning him. The girl, waving her hands, exclaimed that she did not need to be thanked, and in response she said thank you to Albert for saving her. Albert was surprised to hear words of gratitude, and the girl apologized to Albert for not introducing herself, and, pointing her hand at herself, said that her name was Daedalian, and the slime that was with her was called Baum. The slime made a small sound when he heard his name, and Daedalian bowed and once again thanked Albert for not leaving her. Albert was embarrassed by the fact that he was being thanked and therefore, removing his hand and head, he said that he did not need to be thanked so much. He mentally noted that Daedalian was very well-mannered, and said his name out loud, admitting that he was very pleased to meet you. Daedalian noted that Albert dealt with the wyvern very coolly, and admitted that it seemed to her that Albert was the strongest in this forest. Albert, smiling proudly, crossed his arms over his chest and announced that this was all because he had been living for 1,500 years and even survived the war. Daedalian was surprised to hear this and opened her eyes wide, looking at Albert. However, Having gotten over her initial surprise rather quickly, Daedalian waved her hand, saying that she didn't believe it, and apologized to Albert for it. Albert was disappointed, asking himself, would he now be treated as a liar? He suggested that something like this could already happen, and Daedalian, approaching the monster, asked with interest what the wyvern was doing here. Albert thought about it, noting that with poison it is problematic to eat it, but he cannot eat Daedalian. Therefore, Albert knew that he urgently needed to come up with something, and, pointing to the wyvern, he asked if there was poison here too. Daedalian confirmed this, and Albert asked if it was right that it would take a week to get rid of it. Daedalian said that it was true, and Albert, after a short pause, announced that in that case he would eat it. Daedalian shouted in fear that Albert would die immediately, and asked if he had listened to her at all. Albert, desperately looking up, swore, declaring that he would then die from expectations. Daedalian was silent for a while, and then asked if she could help cut up the wyvern. Albert said in disappointment that there was no need to do this and, frowning, said that he did not want to wait a whole week. Daedalian showed Albert Baum, reminding her that she had slime, and explained that it would suck out the poison in just a few hours. Albert asked if this was true. He asked why Daedalian was silent earlier. Holding Baum close, Daedalian apologized to Albert, sadly saying that Baum was rather weak. Baum, trembling, made several quiet sounds, and Daedalian said that they got rid of the spells of the demon Lord Lon. But the fact was that there was no river nearby, and Baum was not well without water. Because of this, all this time Baum tried then Daedalian. Slimes were 99% water. In the center of the body there was a transparent core where liquid accumulated, and it was this core that gave energy and vitality. If Baum hadn't replenished his water supply, he wouldn't have lasted long, and that was the problem. Albert, crossing his arms over his chest, said that everything was clear to him, and asked if it would help if he used water magic. Daedalian, closing her eyes, suggested that this might help, and asked Albert to save Baum. Albert sighed and declared that naturally Daedalian would help, noting that he would help them and they would help him. Daedalian was delighted, thanking Albert for this, and, bowing to him, began to repeat words of gratitude for Albert. Albert said that there was no need to thank him like that, and Daedalian, calling out to Baum, joyfully asked if she heard it. Baum also shouted joyfully, and Albert, watching them, thought that they made a very interesting couple, consisting of a goblin who had been left without strength after the war and a weakened slime. Daedalian, having released Baum, went to her backpack and, taking out a small dagger, exclaimed that so far she would have butchered the wyvern carcass well. Albert noted that it would be great, after which he promised himself that he would try his best, since now it was Albert's turn to reward Daedalian. Placing his palm on Baum, Albert thought that he would be able to eat later, if, of course, he tried hard now. He stretched his arms forward and a huge wave began to form behind him, and Albert asked to be allowed to provide better service and give a water gift. The 7th level water magic was activated and Albert created a tsunami. Baum, noticing this, screamed, and Daedalian began to cut up the wyvern, carefully wielding the knife. Some time passed and Albert asked Baum how it felt. Baum simply screamed, and Albert suggested that it was much better now, and, noting that it was wonderful, asked himself if Baum liked it, and at that moment, Daedalian, calling out to Albert, announced that she had finished, and Albert thanked her for this, after which, pointing his fingers a little to the side, he said that he also tried his best. Daedalian thanked Albert for this, but, looking at where he was pointing, she asked in horror what it was. Baum's huge shadow fell on her. Seeing how Daedalian reacted, Albert asked in confusion what was wrong with her. He recalled that she herself asked Baum to help, and Daedalian, although she did not deny this, closed her eyes and asked Albert for forgiveness, but indignantly asked what he had done. She looked at Baum, who was now huge and even taller than Albert, and asked why Baum had become so huge. Baum simply made a happy noise to get everyone's attention, and Albert held up one finger, explaining that it was all thanks to the wave he had launched. He remembered how he activated the tsunami, and Daedalian said that everything was clear to her. Finally, with a sigh, she forced herself to calm down and admitted that she was glad that everything was finally okay with Baum. She asked if it was true that this one was really like this. She was also glad if others were happy, and moving closer to Baum, she put her palms on it, noting that it was very large. She asked, "How does it feel?" Daedalian asked Baum to deal with the poison, and Baum, making an approving sound, began to suck in the already butchered wyvern carcass, and Albert, seeing this, made a trace of his palm into a fist, joyfully exclaiming that this was gorgeous. The wyvern's body by this time was completely inside Baum, and dark particles of poison began to be drawn out of it. Watching this, Albert put his palm to his chest and, narrowing his eyes slightly, noted that Baum looked like a mother, adding that it was very cute. 30 minutes later, Baum, having sucked all the poison from the wyvern's body, gathered it together and concentrated it near his surface, after which, moving a little to the side, he freed the wyvern's body and then spat out all the poison to the side. Albert, who did not expect this, asked if Baum had really coughed. Daedalian, looking in surprise at the poison and meat, asked if Baum had really already done everything. She noted that it seemed very fast, and Albert asked if that was true. Daedalian, widening her eyes in shock, explained that previously Baum would have managed it in only 2 hours. Albert, who approached Baum and stood with one palm on it, did not answer anything, amazed at Daedalian's words, and Daedalian, smiling, exclaimed that she understood everything, and assumed that it was because Baum was completely healthy. Albert suddenly asked how Daedalian and Baum understand each other. He suggested that they were just communicating, and Daedalian, leaning slightly to one side, looked at Albert in bewilderment, and then confirmed it. Albert, falling back to the ground, sighed, noting that this was not bad, and admitted that he would like it too. Daedalian, clinging to Baum, assumed that all this was because she lived with other demons. In order to console Albert, she noted that he could control magic and asked if it was true that this was also quite good. Albert, looking at the sky, noted that this could be the case, thinking that demons have innate abilities that are characteristic of all living organisms, such as communication. Thanks to this, demons could communicate without using words, and this was very convenient. Thinking about this, Albert imagined that between Baum and Daedalian there was a glowing communication channel invisible to others, thanks to which they understood each other. Even the lowest-ranking, weakest demons have innate talent, and demons at higher ranks are capable of using magic. This is why there were so many warring individuals, but there were also those who were unlucky enough to be born without any talent. Rising, Albert annoyedly thought that he could not do anything, and, looking at Daedalian, thanked her. Daedalian, who began to pack her backpack, also thanked Albert for saving her, and then, putting the backpack on her back, turned her back to Albert, and Albert was surprised to notice this. Daedalian smiled and said goodbye, but Albert, frowning, told Daedalian to stop. Pointing to the meat, he asked if she would like to have lunch together. Daedalian was sincerely amazed at the proposal, asking if it was really possible to do this. Albert asked why this couldn't be done. He asked if Daedalian meant to say that she had supplies. Daedalian admitted that this was not the case, saying that she tried for half a day using only herbs. Albert, who had been sitting before, rose to his feet and exclaimed that he understood everything. Pointing his palm at the meat, he offered to begin, admitting that he was unlikely to eat it all alone. In the end, only with the help of Daedalian and Baum was it possible to get rid of the poison, and so Albert asked if Daedalian agreed. Daedalian, looking at Albert in shock, bowed slightly, thanking him, and admitted that she would be glad to have lunch with him if Albert would allow her to do so. Albert was not against Daedalian joining him and suggested that they start eating. Lowering himself into the lotus position opposite the meat, he clasped his palms together and wished Daedalian a bon appetit. Daedalian was horrified to see this and asked if Albert was going to eat it like that. Albert, frowning slightly, looked at Daedalian in bewilderment and asked, "Is it really not possible to do this?" Daedalian explained that this could not be done, reminding her that it was raw meat, and asked whether it would be better to fry it. Albert said that he had certain difficulties with fire magic, but Daedalian exclaimed that this was not a problem, and, taking off her backpack from her shoulders, showed this to Albert, offering to use her inventory. She smiled, and then took out the object, and Albert, seeing it, asked if it was a magical firestone. Daedalian, holding out the firestone to Albert, confirmed this, saying that Albert could use it. Albert was delighted to see the stone, and Daedalian said that she found it on the road and thought that the stone might be useful. Albert mentally exclaimed that Daedalian was a very good-natured child, realizing that she had every chance of survival. Following this, Albert, becoming much sadder, wrapped his arms around himself, as if hugging him to console him, and asked himself if this really meant that he could very easily die. Daedalian was surprised to see this reaction, but very soon, having collected leaves to make it easier to start a fire, she used the firestone she found to start a fire. The fire flared up almost immediately, and Albert, seeing this, exclaimed enthusiastically. Having prepared the already chopped meat, He announced that in this case he would fry it, since he did not want to shift all the responsibilities to Daedalian alone. Daedalian, who was walking through the clearing collecting firewood, asked Albert not to worry, exclaiming that the main thing was that there would be food. Turning to Albert, she asked if this was true. However, she suddenly fell silent, dropping the already collected firewood from her hands, and Albert, noticing this, worriedly asked if Daedalian was okay. Daedalian, looking at Albert in fear, asked what he was doing. From horror, her face was covered with sweat, and it was difficult to pronounce words. Albert, who was squatting near the fire and, holding meat in his hands, thrust it into the center of the flame, looked at Daedalian in bewilderment and asked what it was. Finally, he understood what Daedalian was looking at, and after a short silence he noted that everything was clear to him and, looking at his palms, he asked if it could be that there is no need to do this. He realized that he might burn, and, taking the meat out of the fire, he took pity on his poor hands. He apologized to Daedalian and asked if it was possible to ask her to help. Daedalian, still in a state of shock, began to thread the meat onto a small thin branch, promising that she would help. Having dealt with her emotions, she smiled, closed her eyes, and said that she would help with everything. Albert sadly asked Daedalian for forgiveness, after which he moved a little aside and began to communicate with Baum. Finally, when a certain amount of time had passed, Daedalian called out to Baum and Albert, announcing that everything was ready. Albert sniffed, screaming in delight, and turned to see fried meat with juice dripping down it. This made Albert salivate, and he did not look away from the cooked meat. Daedalian admitted that she wished they had salt, but Albert exclaimed that it already looked very tasty. He asked if he could eat already. Daedalian simply nodded, and Albert, taking one of the skewers with meat, announced that in that case he would proceed. He took a bite of a whole piece of meat at once and, having chewed it, closed his eyes in bliss. Saliva appeared at the edge of his mouth, and Albert, continuing to keep his eyes closed, thought that the meat juice was flowing inside him, because he was completely surrendering to the food, filling his stomach with it. Albert continued to eat, removing the second piece of meat from the skewer. Taking the second portion in his hands, he mentally noted that 1,500 years later, his first food was meat fried over a fire without seasoning. And yet, it was the best thing that Albert had ever had in his life, and he even burst into tears at how delicious it was. Feeling tears in his eyes, Albert wiped it with his hand, thinking that he had burst into tears, and Daedalian, who noticed Albert doing this, excitedly asked what was wrong with him. She assumed that he did not like it that much, but Albert said that this was not so, noting that everything was very tasty. He said that this was indeed so, and mentally noted that these were very simple words, but admitted to himself that he could not find other words to convey all his joy. The fire continued to burn, and from this translucent smoke rose into the air, and Albert, who had finished eating like Daedalian, said that there would be water now, and activating the magic asked Daedalian to look at it. Drops of water appeared in the air near his finger, which then moved into Daedalian's palms. Daedalian thanked Albert for this and, having tasted the water, joyfully exclaimed that it was very tasty. Albert was embarrassed but at the same time proud that his creation was praised, and said that Daedalian could not have said this. Some time passed, the fire continued to burn, and Albert lay down on the ground, announcing that he had eaten too much. Without getting up, he asked where Baum and Daedalian would go next. Daedalian, who did not expect this question, did not find what to answer at the very beginning, but in the end she said that they were going to the western forests and would most likely return home. Albert asked if it was close. Daedalian said it was half a day away, explaining that Lon started a fire there 3 months ago. She imagined Lon, commanding an army of wolf people who marched through the village, destroying everything around them. Albert admitted to himself that he could not even imagine that entire settlements had suffered then, and he realized that he was now experiencing disgusting feelings. He assumed that the girls and small children were able to escape, but he understood that many of the men were killed. He imagined a destroyed settlement where the murdered inhabitants lay, and remembered that he too was involved in this, thinking that he had to use magic. At the moment when the village was being destroyed, Daedalian screamed desperately, extending her hand forward, fenced off from everything that was happening by a large lattice. Now she, sadly lowering her head, admitted that she would like to help restore her native village. Albert understood everything and suggested that this should not be surprising. He also understood that Daedalian was in a very difficult time, and Daedalian, replacing sadness with a smile, said that Lon had died and assumed that she would not return to the village alone. Albert asked if Baum would go with Daedalian. Daedalian, placing her palm on Baum, heard it make a sound and assumed that it was similar to this. Baum continued to scream, and Daedalian, hugging it, thanked Baum. Albert, watching their interaction, asked himself how they understood each other, and suddenly Daedalian asked where Albert would go. Albert, imagining the city street, assumed that he would go to far, and then headed somewhere else. He thoughtfully put his hand on his chin, closing his eyes and thinking, and Daedalian realized that in this case Albert would have to cross the mountain range. Turning awkwardly to Albert, she asked where his wings were. Albert, distracted from his thoughts, first asked again, and then, realizing that Daedalian was simply speaking, he explained that his wings unfortunately burned out during the battle for the castle. Albert assumed that he could not tell the whole truth, thinking that if Beria was not there, then they would all be able to live freely. He introduced Beria as well as the other gargoyles, and mentally replied that those gargoyles got rid of Albert in a very ugly way, although he realized that he could understand them. He asked where to go in this case. Besides this, Albert was wondering what the gargoyles were doing in the city now, and realizing what kind of question he was asking, Albert asked himself what is wrong with him. He assumed that his heart had become kinder and admitted to himself that he did not recognize himself. Albert understood that nothing could be done about it, since he had held out for 1,500 years, and now, hitting himself in the chest with his fist, he exclaimed that he was very persistent. Now Albert regretted that he had to fight, and, putting his palm to his chest, closed his eyes, promising that he would never show his anger again, because the next time they met, he would definitely take revenge and would not forgive such a thing. When Albert thought about this, he began to look much more threatening, and Daedalian, seeing this, became afraid and trembled. Albert, noticing this, mentally cursed, realizing that he had scared Daedalian, and, stretching out his hands in her direction, quietly called out to Daedalian, attracting her attention. Daedalian, closing her eyes, asked Albert to forgive her, realizing that she did not need to ask about it. She was sure that it was very rude of her, but Albert, rejecting this assumption, said that everything was in order, since sooner or later they would start talking about it. He assumed that he and Daedalian were similar in some ways, and therefore asked her not to worry. Daedalian calmed down, but was still somewhat wary and surprised when she heard Albert's words. Albert, placing his palm on Daedalian's head, noted that the meat was gorgeous, and asked Daedalian not to worry about anything. Daedalian, smiling, exclaimed that she agreed, and Albert, stretching, yawned, noting that now it would be good to sleep. Turning to Daedalian and Baum, he asked how they were feeling. He asked if they were sleepy. Daedalian was initially surprised to hear this question, and then, smiling, admitted that she felt a little sleepy. She said that she would watch for Albert and told him to go to bed, but Albert, waving his palm, said that this was not suitable, declaring that such a thing could not be done. Daedalian was surprised and asked why he said that. Albert did not answer and simply sat down, placing his palms on the ground, and then activated the water barrier. Along the edge of a small area with enough room for a fire, Albert, Daedalian and Baum, a wall made of water began to appear. Gradually the water level rose until it finally closed high above the treetops, forming a dome. Albert, having finished creating the barrier, pointed his finger at it, explaining that the water barrier would protect them, and said that he would be the first to know about it if something happened to the barrier. Daedalian, enthusiastically looking at the water wall around her, noted that it was very convenient, and Albert, pointing his finger at the water barrier, admitted that magical barriers were not easy for him. Daedalian, awkwardly calling out to Albert, asked if I could touch the water barrier. Albert said that it was just water, but Daedalian was still delighted with what the water barrier was and, touching it with her palms, screamed in delight. Getting ready to go, she declared that this was great and suggested going, but Albert stopped her, warning her that she could leave this barrier, but it would be problematic to enter back. Daedalian was a little scared when she heard this, and then, closing her eyes, she said that she would not do that. She walked to the edge of the barrier and lowered her palms into the transparent walls, again exclaiming enthusiastically. Albert sat down on the ground and, placing his elbow on his knee, rested his cheek on his palm, after which he began to watch Daedalian with emotion. He mentally noted that she was very funny and still very young, suggesting that she was not even 10 years old. Daedalian continued to play with the water barrier, scattering splashes around, and Albert thought that her loved ones and friends were no longer there because of the war. In the end, he decided that it was better not to think about such a thing, and was distracted from his thoughts when Daedalian, turning to him, asked for forgiveness for doing stupid things here. But Alberta, stretching his arms forward, said that everything was fine and suggested that Daedalian play if she liked it. He mentally noted that Daedalian was nice, and remembered that she stopped him when he was about to eat the poisonous meat of the wyvern. Albert realized that he could even die and imagined himself lying on the ground with foam flowing from his mouth. In this case, Daedalian would appear cunning and, grinning, would hide behind the body of the wyvern. Now, looking at the happily smiling Daedalian, who thanked him, Albert admitted to himself that he liked that she was so open and honest, since there were very few such living and bright personalities in this world. Finally, he lay down so that he was comfortable and told Daedalian that he would sleep. Daedalian replied that she understood everything and wished Albert good night. Without answering anything, he simply lay there, looking straight ahead, and before falling asleep, he thought that he did not want to die. It was already night outside, and everything around was illuminated only by the moon, rising high in the sky. A little later, when morning came in the castle, which was still smoking, Beria, covering her face with the palms in which she was holding a towel, shouted that she was in despair. Suddenly someone knocked on the door leading to the spacious room where Beria was, and, calling out to her, announced that he had gathered in the auditorium everyone who wanted to join their army. Beria removed her hands from her face, but was still irritated and stood with her jaw clenched tightly. Finally, she asked the man standing outside the door to give her some time and promised that she would come, asking forgiveness from the other person for the wait. The man behind the door replied that he understood everything, and Beria remained standing, walking to the mirror. She was silent for some time, and then, gritting her teeth furiously, she thought about the gargoyle that was bothering her. In this world there were evil spirits and various demons, which included goblins, wyverns and werewolf monsters, and every time the demons found themselves on the verge of life and death, they only became stronger. At the end of one of these fierce battles, 12 of the strongest demons remained, who began to be called lords. These demons were identified by the silhouettes of people who hid their faces with the hoods of long cloaks. Only 4 of these demons, who were called the Immortal Four, possessed exceptional power. And one of these demons was Beria, who was a demon lord and a descendant of vampires, as well as one of the Immortal Four. She sat at the table, resting her chin on her hand, and thought. 3 years earlier, in her castle, someone indignantly asked what idiot said he planned to conquer this man's domain. The demon girl standing in front of Beria, who was sitting at her desk, announced that this person was the demon lord Lon. Beria thoughtfully placed her finger on her chin, repeating the name Lon, and imagining a man with fur-covered ears and sharp teeth in his mouth. She remembered that this was that uncouth and impudent werewolf. And suddenly, remembering something else, Beria asked if it was true that Lon was Fenrir. Such thoughts made Beria bow her head and fall silent, and the shadow that fell on the upper half of her face from behind her bangs made Beria's face much more eerie. In the end, unable to control her emotions, Beria fell face down on the table, clasping her head in her hands, and mentally asked why Lon did this. Beria was already drowning in work, and therefore was outraged that Lon, whom she called an idiot, wanted to expand his land. The demon girl who told Beria this news simply stood silently and watched as Beria experienced her grief. In the end, the girl reminded Beria that Lon had sworn allegiance, and suggested that they somehow unite and include Lon in Beria's faction. Beria, hearing this, stood up, smiled enthusiastically, and, raising her finger up, exclaimed that this was a great idea. She realized that then she would not have to fight, noting that it would be great if they made an alliance with the Lord of Lon if he was with them. The girl bowed, saying that Beria could try to resolve everything through peaceful negotiations. Beria happily agreed with the girl, exclaiming that she was right, and meanwhile the maid, taking out an envelope sealed with a wax seal, said that a message had just arrived from Lon. Taking the envelope in her hands, Beria opened it and read that on the paper was written a promise to kill Beria, due to the fact that in this case Beria's place in the Immortal Four would belong to Lon. When Beria read this, she was silent for a while, and then asked herself, what kind of fool is this? She sharply lowered her head, and the servant girl, frightened by such an unexpected change in mood, asked excitedly if Beria was okay. Beria assumed that war could not be avoided, and, placing her palm on her forehead, lowered her head, asking herself what to do. Sighing, she noted with concentration that conquering impossible peaks was in the spirit of Fenrir. Both Beria and Lon's had their own advantages suitable for battle, and none of them knew whose advantages would be stronger. Beria decided that she would make Lon beg for mercy and take his castle for herself. 3 years earlier, near the castle of Lon's, in front of the gates of this, a camp of Beria's troops was located. There were tents right under the defensive walls as well as boxes of supplies. Beria announced that they would begin the offensive tomorrow, warning the soldiers that they could relax for today. However, she still asked them not to lose their vigilance, and the soldiers, placing their palms to their temples, expressed their agreement with Beria's order. And suddenly one of the soldiers got distracted, noticing something upstairs, and asked what it was there. Another soldier, taking a closer look, said that some kind of nonsense was flying there, and Beria, interested, frowned in concentration, and then, turning around, saw a gargoyle flying along the walls. It was Albert, and Beria, taking a closer look at him, noted that judging by his eyes, one could understand that Albert was under a spell. Thinking for a moment, she noted that this was very interesting, suggesting that this was a common thing here. One of the soldiers, stretching his arms towards Albert, activated a fire bullet, and the magical attack flew into the air and exploded, reaching Albert. Looking at the dissipating dust and remnants of the fire, Beria admitted to herself that she had no idea what their goal was, but she realized that they had definitely gotten rid of that goal. She clenched her hands into fists, noting that this place was filled with those under the spell. They were controlled, but only their emotions remained not subject to magic. Lon used these creatures in battle as puppets, and Beria was not sure that doing so was a good thing. And yet, whether to die or live could only be decided by the people themselves, and not by Lon, and frowning, Beria pressed her lips tightly together. Turning her back to the dissipating cloud of dust, she closed her eyes and thought that they were about to blow up Albert, assuming that he wanted to live. However, when the dust remaining after the explosion disappeared, scattering to the sides, some sound was heard, and Beria, attracted by this, turned around, seeing Albert, on whose face no damage was noticeable. Beria asked if Albert was okay. She theorized that the gargoyle was immune to fire magic, noting that it seemed as if Albert had never even encountered magic. This made Beria look horrified and frown in concentration. She continued to peer at Albert, who was calmly flying on and as if not noticing what had just happened. The magic that Albert was exposed to was different from Beria's magic, and she clenched her jaw tightly and looked desperately at Albert, asking herself, is this really her limit? The way Albert moved made Beria even more afraid, and she asked if Albert was under a 7th-level magic spell. Frowning, she cursed, because she understood that in this case everything was very bad. If they encountered the highest magic, then they would all be finished. Realizing this, Beria ran forward, ignoring the calls of the soldiers who asked where she was going. Using her wings, Beria rose to the top, deciding that she would stop Albert and, at all costs, destroy him and then Lon. Having climbed the defensive wall, she approached Albert flying just above it and thought that if Lon died, then his spell would subside. Pursing her lips in concentration, she extended her hands towards Albert, and noted that in this case, these gargoyles would no longer serve Lon. However, Albert sensed movement and turned his head in her direction, frowning. Following this, he very quickly approached Beria and grabbed her by the hair. Beria screamed, first covering one eye, and then squeezing it shut in pain. She clenched her teeth, and Albert, crouching on one knee, waved his arms, spinning Beria in the air, and then pierced her with his weapon. Beria screamed in pain, blood sprayed from her wound, and Albert spat poisonous saliva in her face. Trembling in pain, Beria extended her hand towards Albert before activating a fire ferocity that engulfed Albert's wings in flames. To strengthen her attack, Beria shouted an inferno spell, thinking that this should stop Albert. After that, frowning, Beria noted that it was Lon's turn, and upon reaching Lon, she also burned him with flames, noting that this was the end of Lon. To be honest, compared to Albert, Lon seemed to Beria to be a rather weak opponent. Now, from remembering this fight, Beria was distracted by someone's voice, which, calling out to her, asked if Beria was ready. Beria exclaimed that she needed a little more time, and remembered that they were waiting for her. The man waiting outside the door agreed, noting that then they would be waiting for Beria. Turning towards the door, Beria heard someone ask more quietly, "What happened to Beria?" Bertha began to sweat slightly with excitement and, sighing, closed her eyes and lowered her head. Right before Lon died, She asked him about Albert, but assumed that Lon did not understand what Beria was talking about. She remembered how she stood opposite Lon, who was sitting surrounded by smoke, and now noted that she had retained her place in the Immortal Four. After Lon's terrifying control, Beria decided to find Albert, and as far as she knew, he was heading somewhere to the southern part. Now, looking at her reflection in the mirror, Beria expressed the hope that after everything that happened, Albert would be okay. She thought about what would happen if Albert was capable of more, and decided that it would be good to make him her subordinate. Beria was quite sad and suggested that now Albert hated life because of his burnt wings. Suddenly someone called out to Beria again, apologizing to her, but warning her that she no longer had time, since everyone who could was helping them. Beria was amazed to hear this and asked what this meant. The man behind the door shouted that 2 hours had already passed, and Beria asked herself, what does this mean? She desperately asked the person behind the door not to come in and look at her. However, at the same moment the door opened, and the servant girl, apologizing to Beria, went inside and, closing her eyes, smiled, asking Beria to tell her how the girl could help her. However, the girl suddenly opened her eyes wide and froze, noticing that a darker spot had formed on Beria's face in the place where Albert's saliva had fallen. Amazed, the girl drew Beria's attention to her face, and Beria, hearing this, frowned, pursed her lips more tightly and, falling to her knees, lowered her head, thinking that this was a very great shame. Around the same time, when the sun illuminated everything around him, Albert sat up and, stretching, woke up. Daedalian, who had also gotten up by this time, wished Albert good morning. Baum made a sound to draw attention to himself, and Albert, tears welling up in his eyes from how hard he stretched, wished Daedalian and Baum good morning in response. And suddenly he noticed that Daedalian was looking at him very strangely and asked what was the strange expression on her face. Albert assumed that Daedalian had not gotten enough sleep, but Daedalian said that was not the case, admitting that she slept almost like a rock. Albert asked what about her suggestion then to look for all sorts of branches to prepare breakfast. Daedalian did not answer this question, but simply admitted that she was thinking about the village, which would be difficult to restore. Albert, screaming in surprise, asked Daedalian for forgiveness for his tactlessness, but Daedalian, getting up from the log on which she had been sitting before, said that everything was fine, and announced that the most important thing was to be safe now. Albert, with a wave of his hand, removed the water barrier, and Daedalian, closing her eyes and smiling, asked if they would cook breakfast. Very little time passed, and Daedalian, having laid out the collected twigs, lit a fire, holding in one of her hands the meat already skewered on the twig, after which she asked if Albert had decided to go through the mountains. Albert, scratching his chin with his finger, replied that he would most likely go, since he would not be able to fly. But he also noted that in this case he would have to be careful not to bump into anyone, and imagined how he would stand in front of a huge monster blocking his path. Daedalian asked if Albert could use magic. Albert admitted that he uses this only in special cases, for example, if he needs to overcome a difficult distance of 100 meters. Daedalian screamed in amazement, turning her head towards Albert, and asked in shock, could he really even do that? Albert, narrowing his eyes a little, admitted that after this he was very tired. His magic made it possible to find out whether there were enemies or other evil spirits in the nearest diameter. Thinking about this, Albert imagined a schematic representation of himself, as well as spheres of magic extending to the space around him and revealing the presence of monsters at a certain distance. And although this magic only worked for 100 meters, the information was accurate, but at this moment Albert was not entirely free to control himself and was disoriented. That is why he limited himself to 10 meters, but assumed that this was at least something. Closing his eyes, Albert thought that, just in case, he would use this ability every time on the road so that in case of a surprise attack he would be ready to attack. Albert remembered walking through the forest, using his magic to protect himself from the monsters hiding in the bushes if anything happened. Now sighing, Albert said that he would have to overcome the mountains, although, to be honest, he was scared that something might happen. By this point, Daedalian had already laid out the prepared meat on a flat stone covered with leaves, and sighing, announced that everything was ready. Albert screamed with delight as he looked at breakfast, and Daedalian admitted that she didn't think anything would happen on the way to the mountains. Albert asked in bewilderment why she said that. He looked up from eating meat for a while, and Daedalian said that there was an electric dragon in the mountains, and that was why it was very light at night. She, looking a little to the side at the mountain on the top of which a radiance could be seen, asked, "Doesn't Albert see this?" She was sure that if he stayed the course, nothing would happen to him. Albert, who also looked in the direction Daedalian was looking at, admitted that he did not know this and asked if this electric dragon was dangerous. Daedalian admitted that she had not heard of it causing harm to anyone, adding that she thought that if Albert did not touch it, then the dragon would not touch Albert. Albert understood everything and thanked Daedalian for the information, after which he finished the last piece of meat, removing it from the skewer. After chewing, he asked why it was light there even at night, but he asked, "Isn't it striking?" Daedalian was surprised to hear this question, and then said that she heard that it was that 2,000 years ago, an electric dragon released all the light of it. She didn't know if it was true or just rumors, and Albert assumed that a lot had changed since then. Placing the empty skewers back on the leaf-covered stone, he thanked Daedalian for the food, and Daedalian, although somewhat hesitant, agreed with Albert. Sighing, Albert announced that he was full and said that he could now set out on the road. And suddenly Daedalian screamed, and Albert, surprised, asked what was wrong with her. Daedalian asked Albert to wait and, showing him the bag, asked him to take it. Daedalian smiled happily, holding out the bag, and Albert, taking it, asked what was in there. Daedalian explained that she had been doing this all morning and remembered sewing a wyvern skin bag while Albert slept, admitting that she thought Albert would have trouble carrying the remaining meat in his hands. There was very little in the bag, but Daedalian would have been glad if Albert liked it. Closing her eyes, she smiled, and Albert froze, not expecting this. He thought about what Daedalian was like, and then decided something and, placing his hands on his knees, began to say something, but did not finish the sentence. Daedalian looked at Albert in surprise, not expecting such behavior, and Albert, holding his finger up, said that he would go with her to her village. Daedalian asked in bewilderment, her eyes wide and her mouth parted in bewilderment, and asked if Albert was not heading into the city. Albert said that this was true, but explained that he now had enough food, adding that he was in no hurry. Since everything happened like this, he asked why don't they stay together a little longer? Daedalian was still shocked and could not say anything other than the name Albert, and Albert, seeing such a reaction, closed his eyes a little, mentally expressing the hope that Daedalian would allow him to go with her. He asked aloud if it was true that the village of Daedalian was destroyed by the werewolves of Lon. Daedalian began to look very sad when she heard this, and Albert thought that he knew that this was really true. Thoughtfully holding his chin in his hand, he imagined werewolf monsters, noting that these were real monsters. He was sure that it was still wandering around somewhere even after Lang's death, guessing that it had become hungry, like Albert had recently. However, in Albert's thoughts, these werewolves did not hunt other monsters, but destroyed those who were like Daedalian. That is why Albert mentally noted that Daedalian would not notice if some evil spirit wanted to get closer. And, realizing that Daedalian had still not answered anything, he asked if he really couldn't go with her. Daedalian screamed, admitting that she would be very happy, and Baum confirmed her words, also making a joyful sound. Daedalian, after listening to this, added that Baum was also delighted, and Albert, realizing this, said that then he would be glad to continue their journey. Daedalian, having gotten over her shock, smiled, exclaiming that she too would be happy. Albert, rising to his feet, threw the new bag over his shoulder and went with Baum and Daedalian to the village. This is how he decided to walk to the Daedalian village with her. Some time passed on the road, and to start a conversation, Albert asked if all this time Daedalian and Baum had been eating only herbs. Daedalian, who was walking a little ahead, turned to Albert saying that everything was correct and, imagining what they ate, said that, for example, they ate peaceberries, torrent seeds, and, of course, lodi grass. Albert did not understand anything, and Daedalian, continuing to talk, noted that it was not easy to assemble. However, smiling, she asked Albert to speak if he wanted to try it, and promised that they would treat him. Albert thought that Daedalian was very kind and said out loud that he would look forward to this with pleasure. They continued on their way, and after some time, Albert closed his eyes, thinking that he was about to turn into a fish. He didn't say anything out loud, but he asked himself why Baum and Daedalian were so fast. He also suggested that he might be slow, and suddenly Baum made a sound, attracting Daedalian's attention. After hearing this, Daedalian looked at Albert and explained that Baum was inviting Albert to climb on it. Albert asked again in bewilderment, not realizing what Daedalian's words meant, and then, jumping on Baum, exclaimed that this was a real man, and then asked how Baum understood what exactly Albert needed. Baum made a small noise and Albert thanked him for it. Some more time passed and finally Daedalian, stopping, quietly looked forward a little sadly, announcing that they had arrived. Albert, looking at the place they found themselves in front of, asked if this was really here. He was amazed that this was the Daedalian home, and looked at the ruined settlement, where every house had been razed almost to the ground. Fences were broken, and few buildings remained roofed or had even a few intact walls. Albert got off Baum, and for a while no one said anything, and after sniffing, Albert put his hand on his chin and admitted that it was very strange that there was no smell in the rot. Daedalian, hearing this, was silent for some time, and then assumed that her relatives had returned and were simply hiding. Running a little forward, she loudly shouted that she was the heiress of the Malad family, and also, saying her name, asked if anyone was here. She fell silent, standing still for a while with Albert, and listened until the door of one of the dilapidated houses finally opened. Looking in the direction where the sound of the door opening was heard, Daedalian saw another person who timidly pronounced her name. Recognizing this man, Daedalian smiled joyfully, and the girl standing on the threshold of the destroyed house asked if this was Daedalian. Daedalian, bursting into tears of happiness, shouted Mead's name and ran up to her and hugged her. Mead also smiled, calling out Daedalian's name, and suddenly becoming sad, she admitted that she thought that the werewolves took Daedalian with them, adding that she did not think that she would ever see Daedalian again. Daedalian, crying harder, exclaimed that she was able to return after Lan's death, and suddenly heard someone else calling out to her. Amazed, Daedalian looked at Sally, who was her sister, and asked if she was okay too. Sally, who also left the house, noted that she was fine as Daedalian saw, and then, warily looking ahead at Albert and Baum, asked who it was. Albert and Baum simply stared back at Sally, while Daedalian yelped in surprise and explained that she had met them along the way, noting that the gargoyle's name was Albert and the slime's name was Baum. Mead, looking at Albert in shock, asked if it was really a gargoyle. She asked why they were all walking together. Albert, raising his finger, explained that this is all because there are a huge number of creatures in the forest that are easy to miss. Daedalian, thinking about it, realized that after that wyvern they really never met anyone on their way. They all assumed that all this was due to the army of Lord Beria, because when someone worse than evil spirits comes, all the monsters immediately scatter. Most likely this is how it all happened, and meeting one of the soldiers was much more likely than some kind of evil spirits. Daedalian guessed that this was why Albert came with her, and Albert, confirming this, announced that it was to ensure her safe travel. Daedalian was moved when she heard this and shouted out the name Albert. Mid also understood how everything really happened and, bowing, thanked Albert for this. Albert, shrugging his shoulders, replied that he would have to thank him if there was something to be grateful for. Nid, saying that she was a goblin, also said her name, and Sally, explaining that she was a hobgoblin, also introduced herself. Albert, focusing on the fact that Sally was a hobgoblin, assumed that it was a creature from the goblin family. He responded by saying his name, and when Albert shook Sally's hand, she said that she was glad to meet you, and Albert replied that it was mutual. A little later, they gathered in the house and, having had time to eat, Daedalian asked if Mead knew what happened after Daedalian left the village. Mead asked Daedalian to let her think, and then told her that on the day when Aarmaelan attacked them, the goblins fought with all their might, and then they had to go on the run. She remembered the battle between the goblins and the monsters, and then said that the escaped girls and children were able to find refuge 5 kilometers from here on the western side, and she also noted that if Daedalian wanted, they could visit them. Daedalian understood everything and was glad that the others managed to escape, admitting that she was sorry that she could not help in the battle. Out of disappointment, Daedalian clenched her hands on her knees into fists and, crying, repeated that it was very good that the others survived. Albert remained silent, sitting next to the crying Daedalian, and Mead noted that, as far as she knew, the remaining goblins headed north. Daedalian thanked her for this information, and Sally noted that since Daedalian was able to survive and return from the forest, then maybe they could contact the others. Daedalian, starting to cry, realized that this could really be so, and Albert, thoughtfully holding his chin with his hand, asked what she meant when she said about contact. He asked if it was true that they were about 5 kilometers away. He wasn't sure it would work at that distance, but Sally asked Albert not to doubt it, since they just needed to correctly understand the exact location of the other goblins, and then everything would definitely work out. In addition, thanks to communication using thoughts, the goblins were able to escape from the werewolves. Albert listened carefully to everything that Sally was telling, looking at the smiling Mead, and suddenly Daedalian asked what they were planning to do now. Sally, crossing her arms over her chest, lowered her head, closed her eyes and seriously said that Lon had died, which meant that she could settle in this village again. She thought that it might be something like this, but there was one problem, which was that the werewolves who attacked them were divided among themselves, and there was a chance that one of them would return again. And yet, continuing to hold her hands on her chest, Sally noted that there was no one now, and asked what if in the end they could not escape? And suddenly Albert, raising his palm, attracted attention to himself, admitting that he thought that he could cope with this, since they could also count on him. Sally, Daedalian and Mead asked each other in bewilderment, and Sally asked if Albert was serious. Albert confirmed this, but frowned and thought that there was something else. To begin with, he suggested going outside and, by activating the water barrier, created a dome over the house and a small space in front of it. Daedalian froze, realizing that this was yesterday's thing that Albert did, and Albert, placing his palm on the water barrier, explained that the werewolves will not penetrate here, so now there is one less problem. Sally asked Albert to wait and asked what if they were flooded because of the werewolves. She was sure that they could not allow this, but Daedalian asked that Sally not worry, since this barrier saved her from the wyvern. Daedalian asked again in bewilderment, and then exclaimed that the water barrier was not omnipotent, and, although she did not argue with the fact that it would stop some elves or wyverns, she noted that if the barrier was destroyed, everything would fall on their shoulders. Daedalian wanted to object, asking Sally to stop, but Albert, holding out his hand in front of her, interrupted Daedalian's words and, declaring that this barrier was made of all his love, invited Sally to try to overcome it. Sally thought for a while, and then, frowning seriously, she promised that she would handle it. She stepped outside the barrier and, turning sharply, screamed belligerently, putting her spear forward. She tried to attack the barrier, but was sent flying backwards by the collision with it, crying out in pain. Stepping back a little, she asked in bewilderment how this happened. Despite the defeat, Sally continued to try to attack the barrier using spiral punch, wheel, and kill. Albert, listening to this, thought a little excitedly about the names of Sally's techniques. Some time passed, and Sally fell to her knees, desperately lowering her head down. Daedalian was surprised that even Sally did not overcome this barrier, noting that it was incredible. Albert, looking at Sally kneeling motionless, asked if she was okay. Sally, rising and leaning on her spear, admitted that the defense was strong, and Daedalian wanted to say something, and Albert, guessing what she was saying, sighed, noting that there were some exceptions to this barrier. It was possible to leave, but there was no way to enter, and Sally, who at the same moment tried to return inside, hit the barrier, cursing in displeasure. Placing her palm on her forehead, which she had bruised when colliding with the barrier, Sally said that this would not do, and Albert explained that that was why he said that werewolves would not get through here, since the barrier would not let it through. However, this meant that it would be the same with anyone else. Daedalian was silent for a while, and then realized that even those endowed with magic would not be able to enter, like Albert, for example. Albert asked why this is so. He announced that he could come in and out as much as he wanted without any problems, and Sally asked in bewilderment why this was so. Albert explained that it was because he had a magical coat of arms, and Daedalian and Sally repeated the name at the same time. Albert promised that he would explain, and revealed that when he uses magic, his body also succumbs to the magic, and changes to take the form of whatever he uses, be it water or fire. This is why Albert could do such things and was the best at water. Speaking about this, Albert first introduced himself, inside of which a silhouette appeared, similar to a drop of water or fire, and then said that everyone who has magic has this coat of arms, and depending on the creature it can have a different shape. That is, it was not possible for two different creatures to have the same crest, and this also affected what magic the creature could use. Therefore, the magical coat of arms was directly connected with magic, and Albert, showing a long drop of water that he created, warned that if someone had the same coat of arms, then magic would be useless against each other. Daedalian and Sally were shocked when they heard this, and Albert, after some silence, asked himself if they understood anything. Closing his eyes, he mentally apologized to them for not being able to tell them briefly, and announced out loud that, in other words, each magic has its own coat of arms, and if Albert, being a possessor of magic, created a barrier, he would be able to calmly enter and get through it. Daedalian said that she understood everything, and Sally asked if Albert could make this coat of arms for them. Albert admitted that this was a good question, noting that in theory it was possible, but warned that there was one caveat, and asked what they would do when Albert left and new children appeared. Sally, pressing her lips tighter, realized that this was right, and for a while there was silence, which was disturbed by Baum, who screamed to attract attention. Daedalian was delighted to notice that Baum had returned and asked how it went. Baum let out a cheerful cry, and Albert asked if it was really going for a walk. Baum, jumping, passed through the barrier, found himself inside and, coming closer to Albert, began to try to play. Albert asked Baum to stop and calm down, and suddenly froze in amazement. Daedalian, noticing this, asked what it was. Sally was also amazed, and only Baum continued to shout joyfully. Everyone froze, asking themselves, how did Baum get in? Albert suddenly realized why this happened, and, hitting the fist of one hand on the open palm of the other hand, he remembered that Baum, like Albert's magic, consists of water, and Baum also contains a piece of Albert's coat of arms, since Albert helped Baum using Tsunami spell. This is why Baum became part of Albert's magic, and Daedalian remembered that this was indeed the case. This meant that Baum could share himself with the goblins, and then they could easily penetrate the barrier without Albert's presence. However, then Baum would decrease again, and the entry problem would again appear. Holding his chin in his hand, Albert thought with regret that Baum was not infinite, and suddenly Baum began to scream, attracting attention to himself. Albert was distracted from his thoughts, and Baum, continuing to scream, moved closer to Daedalian, placing part of his body on her hand. Daedalian was surprised, and Albert asked if this was working. Daedalian passed the speed barrier and asked in amazement, "Is it really possible to leave this?" Having gone beyond the barrier, she tried to go inside, closing her eyes as she expected a blow, but she passed through the barrier without any problems. Stopping, she froze in shock, looking at her palms, exclaiming that everything worked out, and Albert called Baum handsome. Daedalian, going up to Baum and placing her palm on it, said that in this case they would often use Baum and asked if it would stand. She understood that everyone would want to go out, but Baum simply screamed confidently, and Daedalian asked if it could really be reborn, and in that case there would be no problems. She realized that they could return to the village, and Albert, screaming in admiration, mentally noted that this skill was very useful. Watching Baum, he noted that this was a wonderful slime, and said out loud that if Baum lived here, then the goblins would no longer have problems with the barrier. Sally, who was helped by Baum through the barrier, realized that this was indeed the case and noted that they could now pass it on to their friends who were hiding in the forest. And suddenly they noticed that it was already evening, and Sally, smiling, thanked Albert, since now thanks to him everyone could return and live happily. Albert, pleased with himself, smiled proudly. Very soon it became completely dark. The moon appeared in the sky instead of the sun, and two girls quietly made their way through the night forest, one of whom, after some silence, announced that a little more and they would reach the goblin village. The other girl, although hesitantly, still agreed with the words of her companion. A few days after the water barrier was created, a large number of goblins, holding crates and bags of supplies, returned to the village smiling. Albert asked if it seemed to him that everyone had already returned. Sally confirmed this, thanking Albert, and suddenly Daedalian, who was helping Sally carry things, heard someone calling out to her. Turning to the side, Daedalian looked in surprise at the person who called to her and realized that it was her mother. Crying with happiness, Daedalian ran forward, hugging the woman, who again shouted her name. Daedalian's mother was happy that Daedalian was okay, and Daedalian was also happy. Albert, sitting on Baum, thanked the gods for this and, wiping away the tears in his eyes with his finger, noted that the meeting between the child and the parent was very touching. He thought that it was still very good that everything had turned out this way, and suddenly suggested that he thought he would leave the goblins for a while. Daedalian, who was hugging her mother, did not pay attention to these words, and Sally asked why Albert would do this. Albert, standing up a little, announced that he needed to find food, and pointing his hand forward, shouted for Baum to go forward. Baum walked through the barrier and walked with Albert through the forest. Albert, looking at what he came across along the way, said that they would eat something they could cope with something. Baum agreed, and suddenly Albert, noticing that he was behaving very strangely, asked what was wrong with Baum. He guessed it thought the fruit they were passing by would be edible. Having picked one of the fruits from the tree, Albert tried it, but almost immediately spat it out, horrified by the taste. And yet he collected several of these fruits, assuming that they had already collected enough supplies. He was not sure about the taste of it, and yet he continued on his way, admitting that for now he had decided to stop in the village and put off the idea of a city for a while. And yet, Albert continued to make plans for his trip to the city, deciding that when he went there, he would certainly begin a relationship with a very beautiful gargoyle girl. Albert happily imagined how he would approach the girl and ask if her mother needed a son-in-law. At Albert's mezzanine, he smiled and handed the girl a flower to the gargoyle, and she said that Albert was very cute. He understood that with cute girls his life as a gargoyle would become even cooler, and he imagined two gargoyle girls who would say that he was beautiful and also admit that they adore him. While Albert was dreaming, Baum looked at him in bewilderment. And suddenly Albert was distracted from his thoughts by hearing something, and, focusing on Baum, who continued to make sounds, he asked if they had just spoken to this. He assumed that Baum was saying that some stranger was trying to break into the barrier, and Baum began to make louder noises, and Albert, frowning, thought that it would be good if he understood what Baum was saying. Interrupting Baum's words, he suggested getting there using Baum's favorite method, and very soon Albert climbed onto Baum, and it began to move at high speed along the forest path between the trees. Albert, who was struggling to stay on Baum, shouted that it was very fast, amazed at the speed. Finally, he noticed a barrier and a village visible behind it, and very soon he saw a girl who, kicking the barrier with her feet, asked what kind of barrier this was. Sally asked Liz to calm down, and Liz, still angry, asked why she couldn't come in. Daedalian, holding a tray of water through the barrier, asked Liz to drink it and calm down. Liz took a glass of water and, quickly drinking it, seriously announced that she was calmness itself, and there was a girl accompanying Liz, closed her eyes, shouted her name, and reminded that they could come in when Albert returned. But Liz was not going to give up and, hitting the barrier again, asked if she really had to wait for some person. Albert, who by this point had gotten off Baum, was excited for Liz and her companion and asked himself, "Who is this anyway?" He realized that this girl was a druid and an elf girl and, noting that they were very close, he trembled, admitting to himself that he did not want to intersect with them at all. Elves and druids always looked magnificent and belonged to the same species. Elves had beautiful golden hair, and girls, as a rule, had an enviable breast size. But their temper was terrible, and now, watching Liz, who was outwardly very beautiful, but without ceasing to be angry, beat the barrier, Albert mentally repeated that her character was simply terrible. Druids, unlike elves, looked very attractive and took advantage of this by deceiving guys. The druid girl who accompanied Liz tried to stop her, saying that she would not succeed. Listening to Liz continue to try to break through the barrier, Albert thought that this was a very noisy elf and realized that he could no longer escape from her. This made him a little more unhappy and sad, as he did not want to be seen by Liz and her druid companion. And suddenly Daedalian, who noticed Albert peeking out from behind a tree, shouted out his name, and Liz, hearing this, turned sharply towards Albert, and Daedalian said that Albert had returned. Albert mentally cursed and, leaving his hiding place, mentally turned to Daedalian and asked why they needed to call him now. He awkwardly announced that he was back and asked why the others were shouting. Liz frowned with displeasure and reminded her that goblins lived here, and therefore asked what Albert forgot here. She, continuing to frown, greeted Albert displeasedly, and Albert asked what kind of greeting she had. He awkwardly greeted Liz in response, and Liz exclaimed that she had come here to see Sally, but could not get inside because some kind of stupid barrier, in her opinion, made her look like a complete idiot and was in the way. Albert noticed that Liz was angry, and Liz suddenly calmed down and put her palm on the barrier, saying that it was cool, since it was the first time she had seen something like that. Albert, scratching his chin with his finger, asked if this meant Liz wasn't angry. He assumed that he had just been praised in this way, admitting to himself that he could not understand when Liz was friendly and when she was ready to kill. Liz at that moment, looking at Albert, sighed, and Sally noted that Liz may be too straightforward, but in fact she is very kind. Albert, looking at the angry Liz, asked if they really were talking about her. Liz at the same moment ordered Albert to immediately let her inside, and Albert, flustered, thought Liz was communicating like a redneck. In the end, he promised that he would let Liz in and, raising his finger, said that he would now cast magic on her. A small drop of water appeared in the air, and Liz, turning to the barrier, asked if she could then go inside, and suddenly the druid girl, starting to bow frequently, asked Albert for forgiveness, but he refused, saying that nothing of the sort had happened. Very soon everyone found themselves inside the barrier and entering the house, which was the only one left more or less intact. Sally, who sat down at the table opposite Liz and her companion, asked what brought Liz and Maya here. Maya, sitting next to Liz, said that they came here to ask the goblins for a favor. Sally was surprised and asked what favor they wanted to ask for. Maya said that she heard the voices of other druids in the forest and admitted that she wanted to know where they were and if they were okay. Everyone else understood everything, and Maya, continuing to speak, noted that as soon as she realized that they were alive, she immediately headed towards the goblins. After the war between the lords of Lon and Beria, the creatures locked in the castle were finally able to gain freedom and scatter through the forest, and now they were trying to return to their previous home. Among these creatures were monsters that could walk on 2 legs, and those that were more like animals and could only move on 4 legs. However, at any moment, these creatures could become someone's dinner, of course, if they do not use magic if they have it. However, to be honest, they managed to find their tribe and even reach them. Daedalian and Sally froze, realizing what this meant, and Daedalian, looking sadly at Albert, said his name. Albert didn't understand what Daedalian wanted from him at the beginning, so he asked what it was. However, even before Daedalian explained, he understood what was required of him and said that it was not a problem since his barrier could protect others too. Maya happily shouted the name Albert, was delighted and admitted that she thought it was impossible to get through this barrier. She noted that they couldn't do it, and Albert, bowing his head slightly, admitted that he was sorry. Maya, meanwhile, added that although the eaters had magic, fighting and defending themselves was problematic for them, and therefore she was afraid that they would simply die. That was why they were here, and with a serious frown, Maya suggested that the goblins combine their powers. Daedalian and Sally were silent for a while, thinking, and finally Sally, sighing, apologized to Maya, as she thought that this would be problematic, because goblins, in her opinion, were not the most suitable option. If this was the case, Daedalian assumed that the druids were capable of taking care of themselves, since they possessed magic and could quite possibly use it in battle. Moreover, the druid's abilities will develop, and, introducing Maya, who will strengthen Sally's weapons. Sally asked if she understood correctly that the druids want to use goblins as weapons. Maya, sighing, closed her eyes, confirming that this was indeed the case, and asked the goblins for forgiveness, after which, lowering her head, she announced that they are only capable of magic, which allows, for example, to make weapons, but physically they are powerless. They could make any weapon for the goblins they wanted, and Maya promised that she would ensure that the druids would keep the forest creatures safe if the goblins accepted their offer. She asked what Sally and the others thought about this. Sally sat for a while, silently crossing her arms, and then suddenly smiled and said that she had heard Maya, suggesting that this would need to be discussed with the others. In any case, according to Sally, Maya and Liz should have spent the night here today. Maya was delighted and, smiling and closing her eyes, thanked Sally for this. And suddenly Liz remembered something she wanted to say, and the others, hearing that she began to say something but did not finish, asked what it was. Liz announced that they had brought this little something for the goblins to celebrate the reunion and began to take various items out of her bag. Albert, looking at this, mentally noted that this was a lot, and Sally asked in bewilderment, "Is it really for them?" Liz smiled with a wink, exclaiming that it was mutual support, and added that Maya made the maple syrup. Albert realized how things really were and, watching Liz smiling, assumed that she was really kind. And suddenly Liz, having stopped smiling, looked at Albert, after which, turning to him, she seriously announced that there was a conversation and offered to go and leave. Albert froze a little scared because Liz's choice fell on him, and after that he admitted to himself that he was even a little glad about it. Albert and Liz walked outside the barrier, and when they had walked some distance, Liz told Albert that they could stop. She admitted that she would like to get to know Albert again and, placing her palm on her chest, said that her name was Liz. Albert, proudly pointing his finger at himself, exclaimed that this was a good idea and said that he was the strongest warrior in the world named Albert. Liz understood everything and admitted that she had never seen gargoyles before. Albert, meanwhile, realizing what had just happened, asked himself, what kind of answer is this? Liz asked what kind of creature Albert was. Albert thought for a moment, not knowing what to say, and then announced that he was a real gargoyle, the one and only of his kind. Liz, coming closer to Albert, asked if this was true. Albert confirmed this and, looking at the concentrated Liz, mentally exclaimed that she was very nice. Liz turned around, put her hand on her chin, and said that she wanted to talk about the Albert barrier. She understood that it was not so easy to get into this, either on her own, or even with the use of magic. Albert, putting his hands down and leaning forward slightly, asked who told Liz this, and suddenly he, frowning, announced that he had heard something and asked if Liz was really an elf. Liz was surprised by this question, and so she turned to Albert, who asked if Liz was hiding her powers. Liz was silent for a moment, and Albert, assuming that she would not answer, sighed, deciding that he would find out about it later. But even before Albert finished his sentence, Liz said that she was a high elf. Albert froze, amazed that she had admitted it herself, and Liz explained that her magic could harm someone, and that was why she was hiding it. Albert understood how things really were and added that he could understand Liz. He admitted that he was also meeting a high elf for the first time, and Liz said that there were few of them left. High elves belonged to the same clan as ordinary elves, but only they were able to use the magic of fire, water, earth, and wind. Thinking about this, Albert imagined Liz controlling several elements at the same time. But even before he could say or think anything, Liz, sharply extending her hand towards Albert, came closer to him so that her fingers stopped at a very short distance from Albert's nose, and announced that this would be her advice for him, saying, no matter what rare creature Albert was in front of, it was better not to even try to find out more about him. Albert, narrowing his eyes, agreed with this advice, and suddenly remembered that Liz had said that there were not many of them left, and asked how many approximately. Liz said that there were only 5 left including her, announcing that the first was the Demon Lord, the next 3 were her minions, and the last was Liz, the younger sister of the Demon Lord. Albert, hearing this, asked again in bewilderment, sweating from tension and realizing that he was finished. He understood that Liz was dangerous, and, continuing to be in tension, asked whether Liz was aware of what she was saying. He admitted that it would be better if he did not know this, since he was not bad, and asked that no one else think so. Seeing how Albert reacted to her words, Liz looked at him, and Albert asked himself what should he do, run away or give up. He asked what the high elf forgot in such a place. Liz sighed, crossed her arms over her chest, and announced that she was traveling because she hated boredom and therefore decided to see the world. During her travels, Liz made new friends, and Albert, introducing Sally and Maya, simply asked how they met. Liz said that she was lost then, and Maya and Sally helped her. Albert sighed and asked in shock, was the high elf lost? Liz, angry, ordered Albert to shut up, declaring that it was a long time ago, and admitted that she was now an experienced traveler and knew her entire country inside and out. Albert said that he understood everything, and especially focused his attention on what Liz said about her country. Liz, meanwhile, continuing to be angry, exclaimed that she was normal and asked Albert not to even think about anything else. Albert said that he heard Liz, although he admitted that it was difficult to believe it. Liz advised him to listen more carefully in this case. Some time passed, it became darker outside, and Liz, frowning a little, asked if it was because of Beria that Albert was missing her wings by chance. She noted that he could lie, also admitting that she didn't particularly want to believe in such a thing. Albert said that he heard her, and added that Liz might not believe him. Suddenly he remembered something and decided that he needed to repay the debt. Liz, surprised, smiled and asked impatiently, what is this? Albert, putting his hand into the bag given to him by Daedalian, took out a hair belonging to Beria and showed it to Liz. Liz squinted at the hair and asked what it was. She felt a little awkward seeing it, and Albert admitted that he thought Liz might give it to someone. Liz asked Albert to wait a little and wanted to express her guess about what it could be, but Albert, guessing what Liz wanted to say, said that everything was correct, interrupting her words. He announced that this was the hair of that same vampire, presenting the appearance of Beria. Liz was scared when she heard this, and Albert said that he would like her to be an intermediary between him and Beria. Liz asked if Albert was joking. She didn't understand why he kept it at all, and Albert replied that he kept it in case he had to fight again. Liz asked that Albert was in no hurry, and, frowning, asked how he could create such a gorgeous barrier, but at the same time be such a blockhead. Albert, offended, thought that he had tried, and Liz suddenly said that she could not give Albert anything in return, asking if he understood how valuable her hair was. But Albert understood and didn't care, but in the end he asked that Liz be there if he needed help. Liz stood for a while, thinking, and in the end, turning her back to Albert, said that she would take Beria's hair from him and do everything in her power. Albert decided that they had agreed, and, coming closer to Liz from behind, he asked if she was saying that she would do everything in her power. Liz said a little irritably that he had gotten it all wrong, and Albert asked how he had gotten it wrong. He said that he understood as he understood, and called Liz a depraved elf. Liz, angry, asked who else was depraved here. Albert repeated that she misunderstood him, and Liz, distracted from this topic, closed her eyes, admitting that she was calm, because she had been on alert all this time, and the gargoyle's barrier works well. Albert asked why Liz was so calm. Liz said that a normal creature keeps all kinds of jewelry in its inventory, and asked what kind of idiot would keep such things. Albert became sad when he heard that he was called a name, and Liz suddenly smiled and said that so be it, and announced that she hated Albert. Albert froze in shock, asking himself how to understand this. However, he was even glad that it all worked out this way, although, to be honest, he didn't understand Liz at all. And suddenly Liz and Albert heard someone shouting their names, and, turning around, they saw Maya running out of the bushes, who shouted that trouble had come, since the werewolves had returned. Around the same time, the werewolf, leading a small goblin on a chain attached to a collar, kicked it in the back, ordering him to go faster. The little goblin, unable to stay on his feet, fell, and the other goblin, who was also captured, cried out in fear when he saw this. The werewolf annoyedly ordered the goblins to move, calling them useless. And suddenly one of the goblins asked the werewolves to stop and not mock Asta. And she tried to stop Lin, but did not have time to say anything other than his name, because one of the werewolves, angry, began to beat the goblins, shouting that the slaves should not resist. Another werewolf, almost in tears, asked his comrade not to kill the goblins. Very soon they continued on their way, handing Lin and Asta heavy backpacks and bags. When Albert returned to the village, closed by a water shield, Sally asked if Asta and Lin had been captured by werewolves. Maya, sadly closing her eyes and lowering her head, said that this was so, and Sally asked if Asta was alive. She cursed irritably, and Daedalian explained that Asta was Sally's brother. Albert was amazed and asked again, and suddenly Liz, inviting Sally to go, promised that she would help her. She wanted to enter the house to take the necessary things, but suddenly someone stopped her, and hearing this, Liz froze on the threshold of the house, and Albert asked if she would really go to the werewolves empty-handed. Liz confirmed that she would do this, shouting that the werewolves would not do anything to her. She frowned in irritation, and Albert mentally noted that this could indeed be the case, and asked if he could defeat it. However, almost immediately he noted that he could not afford to lose, and still wanted to think about what other options there were, but did not have time to finish the thought, asking how they would save Asta if there were only two of them. Liz froze with displeasure, pursing her lips, and suggested talking less and doing more, because if they stand still, they will achieve nothing at all. And suddenly Daedalian suggested just trying to talk to the werewolves, but Albert declared that this was a bad idea, since he did not think that the werewolves would agree. The werewolves were strong and hungry for more, and so no one knew what the price for the desire would be. For a while everyone was silent, thinking about what could be done, and suddenly Albert came up with something and exclaimed that he would help them. Liz, visibly delighted, smiled and asked if Albert was really saying this seriously. Albert confirmed this, noting that it wouldn't be fair if Liz went alone. He repeated that he would go with them, and Liz, admiring Albert's attitude, confidently exclaimed that they could handle it. Albert admitted that he really hoped so, but everyone was sure that they would save Asta. Albert asked if these were two weak enemies for Liz. Liz told him to just keep quiet, exclaiming that everything would go great. Albert promised that he would destroy the werewolves, since Liz said so. Liz agreed that this would be the case and offered to get down to business. Some more time passed, it became completely dark outside, and Asta and Lin continued to walk, connected to the werewolves by heavy chains. And suddenly one of the werewolves, relaxingly throwing his hands behind his head, asked how long to go. Another werewolf, who was holding chains attached to the collars on the necks of Lin and Asta, replied that no one knew, and suddenly froze, noticing two silhouettes behind the bushes. This being wary asked, "Who is there?" Liz and Albert were sitting behind the bushes. The werewolves asked if there was anyone there. They ordered these people to show themselves, and Albert, holding Liz by the chain, put his hand on the neck and awkwardly greeted the werewolves. The werewolves stopped and asked who Albert was. They assumed he was a gargoyle, and Albert replied that he was indeed something like that. Looking at Liz, who was dressed in a torn cloak, they asked what kind of woman he was leading. Liz was unpleasant to hear this, but she still remained silent, and Albert said that this was his servant. The werewolves sniffed, guessing who Liz might be, and, coming closer, one of the werewolves put his hand on Liz's head. Albert, guessing what kind of assumption this was, exclaimed that this could not be more accurate, and the werewolves, with a sharp tug, took off the cloak Liz was wearing. Liz remained standing in a thin, torn piece of fabric, which practically did not warm her up. From embarrassment, Liz began to sweat, and also trembled from humiliation, and the werewolves, looking at her, exclaimed that this was a girl, but also an elf. Albert, frowning decisively, mentally asked Liz to show what she was capable of. The moment he promised that they would destroy the werewolves, they came up with a plan which was to offer Liz to the werewolves under the guise of a slave. Once the werewolves believed and became interested in Liz, Albert was supposed to offer to trade Liz for the goblins. The werewolves had to agree, in which case everything would have worked out perfectly. But there was only one caveat, which was that Liz had to be left alone with the werewolves. For the plan to work, Albert knelt down and begged Liz to agree, exclaiming that she would make a wonderful bait. Liz indignantly asked if Albert had gone crazy. Albert exclaimed that it would all be for the sake of Asta, and Liz did not know how to respond to this. However, they were all confident that they would not lose, and now Liz, who had nevertheless agreed to the plan, stood surrounded by werewolves, who, looking at her, noted that she had good flesh, and added that Liz was very cute. One of them exclaimed that he would be the first, but Albert stopped the werewolves, reminding them that this was his elf. The werewolves looked at Albert and asked, "Is this really so?" They announced that in this case they would take Liz with them, but Albert, who continued to hold the chain in his hands, again repeated that this was his slave. The werewolves laughed and promised that then they would kill Albert, and he, closing his eyes, covered his face with his palm, shouting that the werewolves should not do this. At the same time, he thought displeasedly that werewolves were having fun, and then suddenly suggested exchanging Liz for goblins. At first, the werewolves did not understand what Albert was offering, and he, pointing his finger at Lim and Asta, said that in case the war happened again, slaves would not be superfluous. The werewolves began to look at each other, asking each other what they would do. Albert, putting his hand on Liz's shoulder, confidently thought that the werewolves would agree, and, calling out to Liz in a whisper, waited for her to pay attention to him, and asked her to agree no matter what he said. Liz asked in bewilderment what Albert was talking about. Albert did not answer and, grabbing Liz by the chained hands, pointed his finger at her, explaining that Liz was a virgin. Liz asked again embarrassedly, and Albert, not paying attention to this, said that he had just come from the city of Farah and bought it there. He immediately added that he didn't need Liz, and, sharply raising Liz's hands up, asked the werewolves to look at her. Liz screamed, not expecting something like this, and Albert announced that she had a very cute face and gorgeous breasts, and also asked the werewolves to pay attention to what kind of butt Liz has. He continued to praise Liz's body, adding that he didn't even touch her, and Liz, who was practically not covered by the rag she was wearing, indignantly asked, "What is this?" Albert, meanwhile, noted that she was a real beauty, and said that the werewolves would be able to have a lot of fun with her, and after they played with her, they would immediately feel heavenly pleasure. Albert assured the werewolves of this, and the werewolves thought, and Liz, clenching her jaw tightly, tried to cope with her anger. Albert, to finally convince the werewolves, exclaimed that Liz was simply incredible, and noted that goblins were not needed when there was such a woman. One of the werewolves, grinning, asked if it might be easier for them to kill Albert. Albert was silent for a while, but in the end he agreed that perhaps it would be easier this way, but asked what would happen if he got rid of himself. The werewolves asked in bewilderment, "What is Albert saying?" Albert asked again, "Do werewolves need goblins when they are not even useful?" He asked, "Wouldn't it be better for the werewolves to enjoy something truly beautiful?" The werewolves realized that Albert was saying good things, and one of them, thoughtfully holding his chin with his hand, asked if his comrade really thought so. Albert mentally expressed the hope that they would believe him, since he was lying and did not even blush. Finally, the werewolves agreed, declaring that the goblins would belong to Albert, and added that he would give it to Liz without jokes. One of the werewolves, who was lying in his hands holding the chains connecting Asta and Lin, said that now it belongs to Albert, and Albert thanked the werewolves for this. Taking Asta and Lin, he began to leave, telling them to go, while Liz remained with the werewolves. Albert reassured Asta and Lin that they were safe and promised that Liz would return soon, asking them not to worry. He explained that they had gone so far as to save them, and, mentally turning to Liz, asked her to do as they agreed. At the same time, the werewolves surrounded Liz and began to look at her. They were sure that they would now play with her, and suddenly Liz, grinning, laughed, which greatly surprised the werewolves. Frowning furiously, she ordered that the werewolves not even think about touching her, and, sharply jerking her hands to the sides in such a way that the shackles of her hands broke, she promised that Albert would remember this again. One of the werewolves noted that Liz was very strange, and Liz, with a wave of her hand, used an ice spear, and a sharpened piece of ice appeared in the air, pierced the back of one of the werewolves, and it fell to the ground. The other two werewolves asked what Liz was doing. Liz angrily declared that she was not a toy and added that they had come to save the goblins and teach the werewolves a lesson. She, extending her hand towards the remaining werewolves, shouted that they could not hide from her, and used an air blade, a water blade and stone bullets. The attacks created by Liz simultaneously flew towards the werewolves, and they screamed in pain, and then, falling to the ground, they asked why the elf was so strong. Liz, coming closer to them, explained that this was because she was not an elf, but a high elf. She continued to use magic, and the werewolves screamed in pain, and Albert, who had already walked some distance, cupped his palms with each other, promising that he would pray for these werewolves. He asked that God rest their souls.